This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider joining the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. We're trying to build a safe place to land for those people who are questioning, deconstructing, and deconverting. You can find that at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Time for a correction. I probably should do this more often, but last week's guest, Tom, wanted me to clarify something. I said something to the effect of Tom sharing his experiences in the Transcendental Meditation movement and what pushed him out. Tom wanted to clarify that he still participates in Transcendental Meditation. He no longer accepts the off-grid claims, and he says this specifically, and this is a quote from him. In the Transcendental Meditation movement, he came to decline to believe in the extraordinary claims that have commonly been held by many TM adherents. Apologies to Tom for the inaccuracy there. Hopefully that expresses what Tom actually feels. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. I have to provide a content warning. Our guest today, Julia, is incredibly vulnerable and incredibly honest in her account of a very difficult pregnancy, a lot of hell anxiety, religious trauma, as well as grief over the loss of her mother. Just a lot in this story. So if you're in a vulnerable place right now, you might want to skip this one. Julia lives in Germany, grew up in the Lutheran Church, and then began to be very serious about Christianity, even coming to the United States as an exchange student and becoming much more evangelical in her religious experience. Julia married her husband, who was the son of a charismatic Christian artist in Germany, and thought that she had reached the pinnacle of what she wanted to be in a Christian marriage. While she was pregnant with her first child, it was a very, very difficult pregnancy that had lots of complications. And it came down to whether God's promises to protect her were true or not. Julia also went into the medical field herself and ultimately left medicine in order to be a part of a charismatic healing ministry. The healer in her desire to heal other people, moved her that much. And then also, Julia has just a very expressive way about describing her deconstruction and real anger that she felt toward God. You can find Julia's work on Instagram at Painful Post-Christian Prayers. Here is Julia to tell her story. Julia, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for reaching out. I understand you've been listening to the podcast and it's been a little bit helpful for you in this process. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I've been listening to your podcast for a while. And yeah, at this time, I kind of felt that I was ready to kind of share my story and to contribute something and give something back. So I'm really excited to be here and be able to talk to you.
Excellent. Well, Julia, we always begin with, what was your religious tradition growing up?
Yeah, so I'm actually talking to you from Berlin, Germany. It's the middle of the night here, and so I'm super excited that we managed to get together at the correct time.
Yes.
So I was born and raised in Berlin, and you have to understand that Germany is a very different kind of way of life and culture than the United States, especially concerning like religion and faith is handled very differently in Germany. And so, my parents were not religious. Yeah, not religious at all. My dad was an outspoken atheist, or still is. And my mom used to, just do the traditional Lutheran state church thing. My parents were born in the 1950s, so that was right after the Second World War, pretty much. And so they were kind of living in post-war Germany, and that was just the thing you did back then. You were part of a church community, and that was also part of just surviving, the post-war period. And so But then I was born in the middle of the 1980s, and yeah, I never really felt that there was any religious upbringing in our family. And
Okay.
the first time I even, thought about religion and these types of things was in actually in elementary school, where religion is actually like a school subject that is
Ah,
actually taught in school. I think it's voluntary, so you don't have to, but for some reason I was signed up to to go to religion class, and I had a really good teacher. Like, she was really talented, and she told us Bible stories and stuff. And yeah, so I just kind of loved that. I loved her storytelling ability, and some of the Bible stories are just really, it's easy to engage children. And the story of David, or the and Goliath, or the story of Joseph, and his 12 brothers. And yeah, so I kind of had like a positive view of faith and religion. But I also realized that my dad was like super anti, uh,
okay.
and
Yeah.
and and even then it started that he was kind of like ridiculing me a little bit
Ah,
uh for having an interest even in religious topics, I would say. So there was already kind of like a conflict in within me. It's like I was kind of interested in that type of stuff, but I also sensed that it would probably earn me a lot of ridicule from my dad, if I were to pursue that. And so yeah, that was a struggle for me early on. And towards the end of my elementary school time, me and my classmates, we would all go to what we call confirmation classes. So in Germany, it's usual that a person gets baptized as a baby, and then they confirm that decision that their parents made for them by uh, a Christian ceremony called confirmation. And so
yes. Yeah.
you go to those classes for a while, and then there's a ceremony that's performed, and you kind of rededicate, or yeah, affirm the decision that your parents made for you. And I actually was not baptized as a baby because of my atheist dad.
Okay. All right.
and so and so then I needed to get baptized first, and then I needed to go to
I
confirmation. And
see. Yeah. There's an order of operations.
yes, and I liked being part of that community, and I liked the people there. I liked being part of a group. And so it was actually kind of really important for me. And I remember struggling about the kind of ridicule and the disdain I felt my dad having towards that religion, which kind of made it more interesting for me, I suppose.
Yeah.
uh, and I was like, what did happen to him in his childhood or whatever, that he's so anti? Why is he so angry at a god that he doesn't believe exists? And so yeah. And then I went to, yeah, what you would call, I guess, junior high. And then it's kind of usual that 11th grade in Germany is kind of like an in between kind of transition phase that a lot of people use to go abroad and study somewhere else for a year. And so I applied, and was able to actually spend my junior year of high school in the United States. And so yeah, I went to the States in, I think, yeah, 2003. And you usually stay with a host family during that time. And so that family was part of the First Baptist Church. And so going to church regularly was just part of their regular family life. And in the beginning, I absolutely, totally loved it, because it was so different than what I was used to. Like, having a guitar and stuff and drums on stage would have been unthinkable
Okay.
from the
All right.
tradition I came from. And
Yeah.
everything was so modern and so contemporary, and so there was so much display of emotion and stuff. And I was just blown away. And I think I also had a slight crush on the youth pastor.
Always the way.
Yeah. And so I was really fascinated, and really I loved it, and I couldn't wait to go to church every Sunday, and then Wednesdays for youth group and stuff, and just being part of it, and being able to just explore faith without this constant condescension. um, was just so interesting for me, and I really didn't need to be convinced. I liked it, I loved it, and I was like, oh, faith can look like this. And yeah, and I don't think there are any real Christians in Germany.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, which is kind of odd when you think about, that Europe actually exported Christianity.
Yes. Yes. Something about the Reformation. Yeah. Yes.
Exactly. I remember, I think it was around December. So I moved to the States in August, and then around the Christmas time, I remember being in a youth group meeting, and my youth pastor is going, it's like, I really want to encourage you to invite your friends to youth group, because if you don't bring them here, they're going to go to hell.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, you can't
Yeah.
be serious about this. And because I was kind of like, the Lutheran tradition I grew up in was more on the universalist side of things,
Sure.
I
Sure.
think. And I was just totally shocked. And so then I started like bombarding my host family with questions whether they actually really truly believed that, and what hell was and stuff. And I think they believe in eternal conscious torment. So
Yeah. Okay.
I was shocked, and that um, actually sent me spiraling into a panic attack, because I had
Oh,
already
no.
experienced that type of faith experience in their community, in their congregation, and I had experienced something that I felt was strong and real and interesting, and yeah. And then, so I thought, okay, this is probably the true form of Christianity, and then this, and so I thought, oh my God, the world is lost. I need to get saved, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and then I need to save everybody else, including my family. So I really had a serious panic attack.
How old were you
Uh,
again? This was
I was 17 at the
17.
time.
Now
Hmm.
that's quite a lot to put on the shoulders of a 17-year-old. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned I'm the oldest of two siblings, so I have a younger brother, and I kind of, even in my family of origin, I always had the kind of like the more responsible and very
Yeah.
perfectionistic type of role. And so I was like, oh my God, we need to tell people. And um, yeah, and so I prayed the prayer, I think like 20 times or so, because I was never sure whether it had actually worked.
That's very common.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and it might have been, I don't know, my OCD tendencies showing up. Or, um, so yeah, and then I was like, oh my God, my family's not saved, and what am I gonna do? So I really, I'm very, at that time I was a really black and white thinker, and so I just
Sure.
dove headfirst into Christianity, and I read the Bible from front to cover, cover to cover, and front to back. And we went to a Christian bookstore regularly, and I would buy piles of books and just read apologetics. And I really struggled because I never was sure whether I had enough faith to be
Ah,
saved. And
okay.
so I went back and forth between this, I think I believe, but I'm afraid of hell. And I believe that, so I probably do have enough faith, and I pray the prayer. And did I pray with enough faith? And going back and forth, that was just really exhausting.
Oh man, I bet.
Going through that, plus the language was hard for, well, not hard for me at the time, but it came with more just mental power that went towards doing everything in English. And yeah.
And the isolation, I imagine. No one's speaking to you in German, and that probably feels pretty lonely.
Well, yeah, I didn't really feel lonely because I was
Okay.
immediately part of the community, but and I did talk to my parents on the phone regularly, but still, I also felt like a growing distance to Germany and the German way of
Okay.
life, because I was like so totally involved um, in my family, in my church, and yeah, yeah. So yeah, and so but the but the fear and the dread was kind of a very lonely experience. So I remember, lying awake at night and trying to figure this thing out. I even had thoughts like, "Oh, I need to be really super sure about the salvation thing before I go back, because what if my plane crashes type thing."
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know, it felt way too serious for, the 17-year-old just trying to explore the world and not even sure about anything yet. And yeah. So yeah, but I took everything super seriously and was super committed and was reading. And so I was like totally indoctrinated by the time I returned.
Okay.
And it was really a big struggle for me because now I was like super serious about faith, and uh, my dad was kind of ridiculing me for it and stuff. And I was facing this, this inner struggle of like, wait, no, you need to listen to me, you need to get saved, type
Yeah.
thing. And so then I felt like really lonely back home. And I joined actually an international Baptist church here in Berlin because that actually exists. And so I
Okay.
walked into that church like the first time I visited them, and they were like, it seemed to me like, so, oh, I'm back in America. Everything's in English, and
Okay.
they're singing
Okay.
the same stuff, modern worship songs
Oh,
and stuff.
interesting. It was in English.
Yeah, yeah, because it
Okay.
was an
Yeah.
international church.
I
Uh-huh.
see. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and so I was like, so I guess there are real Christians in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, I completed my high school time, graduated, and then I had, during the time in the States, I had kind of decided that obviously now I need to take my faith super seriously, and so I need to become a doctor and then be a missionary type thing. So I started med school. Um,
Okay. Wow.
um, yeah, in 2007, I started med school, and in med school met a person, a girl, that I kind of befriended, and she also was an evangelical Christian that was part of like a German Swiss type movement of churches. And so she invited me to her church and like, oh, nice, I have a Christian friend in med school now. That's great. We can pray together type thing. Um, and so, yeah, I visited her church and met a guy there who later then became my husband. So that's where I met him. So we started kind of, dating, going out, and he actually happened to be the son of a relatively popular Christian singer songwriter in Germany,
Okay. Okay.
which I did not figure out until we were already kind of seeing each other, and so that was crazy. Um, but for me, this was like, oh, the dream come true. I was like, oh, I'm marrying into a Christian family. Well, that's the best thing
Yeah.
that could have happened to me.
Okay. Okay.
Because that's the dream for the Christian girl, right? To
Yeah. Yes. That's
marry
your only
well,
option.
and yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So some say they go to school to earn an MRS degree.
That's
Uh,
right. A ring by spring or your money
yeah,
back. Yeah.
uh, which, not talking about it now, is like, oh my goodness,
Yes.
fuck purity culture.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, I should
Oh
have
my goodness.
asked, do I get to cuss on your
You get
podcast?
to, yeah, you can express yourself. Absolutely.
Okay, great. And so anyway, so we were seeing each other, and I had very, very certain ideas about how this was going to go down, and very clear expectations of how this relationship was to proceed. And my boyfriend at the time,
Yeah.
uh, I just kind of assumed that he's a Christian and he's the son of this Christian singer songwriter pastor type person. Like, he must be, you know, the deal, like the real
Very,
Christian
very
deal.
dedicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And so I kind of just assumed that he had the same ideas about courtship and stuff. And we read the Joshua Harris books, and oh my goodness.
Oh no. Okay. All right.
um, and so at some point I realized that he did not see things exactly the same way as I did. And
Okay.
so he wasn't, that interested into moving into the next steps of the relationship really quickly. So I was kind of getting desperate because I felt like, okay, so I'm in this position of the Christian girl who is expected to not do anything and wait and pray for, God to show him the right time to kind of pop the question type thing. And,
Yeah.
we were young, we were in love, we wanted to have sex. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was
You were
like,
normal human beings. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah. And I was like, how is this not a problem for him? Why isn't he?
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
was like, why? I like our relationship now. We don't have to. And I was like, I'm dying.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so that led to growing frustration. And I was like, I was starting to resent the way this was happening. And I felt like this Christian role that I was trying to press myself into was really causing me to be in a really bad place because I was
Yeah.
super dependent. I didn't have any um, possibility to make decisions for myself, and I hated it. But I thought I had to do this because this was what God expected of me, and so this actually led to my kind of trying to sort of pressure him, but not too openly because that wasn't, allowed. And so,
Yeah.
and so then we finally did get engaged, which then led to me having another panic attack because I realized, wait, something's totally off. Something went wrong. This didn't go at all like I envisioned it to go, and I didn't want it to be like this. Um, and so I got really sick and really needed to kind of take a break and sort out what was happening. And I even sought the help of a counselor and did some therapy to kind of figure out what was happening, because I had a super strong bodily reaction somehow to
Yeah.
realizing, okay, I'm in this situation and I should be going ahead, but I don't want to. But on the other side, I do want to, and yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I was super conflicted, but I couldn't figure out why. And with the help of counseling, I kind of uh, got on top of the health problem that I was developing. And so at some point we actually did go ahead with our wedding, and by the time I was fine with it. And but I was still like convinced that we were, this Christian couple, and we even in our wedding vows we had this, oh yeah, we're gonna, chase after God together type thing.
Right.
um and so I thought, yeah, we are going to be this really committed Christian couple changing the world for God. And yeah, so that was kind of the way we started our Christian marriage.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and we started attending his church together then. And after a while, I started just being really frustrated with church and how things were being done at this particular type of church. And
Hmm.
uh, there were some theological things I didn't agree with. And at some point I just told him, it's like, you know what, I think I'm not going to go to this church anymore. I just can't. It's triggering me too much. And he was like, so, well, if you don't go anymore, I won't go either. And so
Okay.
we both quit going to church.
Uh-huh.
But for me, it was still clear that I'm still a Christian. I'm still super committed. I pray, I read the Bible, I know God is real type thing. And for my husband, it seemed a little different. Like he had a different experience. I should maybe say he grew up in a Christian home, and his parents actually went to like the super charismatic Christian Bible school in Texas for a
Okay.
while
All
when he
right.
was small, and then he also returned to do his own training uh, in that very charismatic school in
I
Texas.
see. Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
and I think at that point he had already kind of seen through some of the emotional manipulation and the things that were kind of not so nice. I should say, yeah,
When you see behind the curtain, so to speak,
yeah,
of how things are done, and like even worship becomes
mm-hmm,
fairly manipulative,
mm-hmm,
and especially if you're in ministry, you see that part, and it's hard to unsee.
yeah, yeah. It's hard to unsee. Very true. So I think he had already kind of had this, disillusionment with charismatic Christianity, which I had up until that point not even touched. So I came from this Lutheran tradition and then the Baptist tradition, which is not charismatic at all. And so that was kind of still where I was at. I had never spoken in tongues and not done any of that charismania type of stuff. We were just kind of not going to church anymore. I was continuing my education, and at some point, I actually got pregnant and miscarried after, I think, 8 weeks or so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, which I didn't realize was a very common thing to happen,
Yeah.
especially with, first pregnancies, I guess. And so, but it just totally caught me off guard because I didn't think that was going to happen to me, because I felt like, I'm a Christian, I'm under God's protection, right? And so,
Right.
and it's not something that's frequently talked about. So I did know one woman from our church, though, that I used to attend, that at some point I had heard that she had actually miscarried at some point. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to call her and ask about this, because I was really upset. And it was kind of like, why did God let this happen to me? Question. And so I talked to her, and she did say that she was sorry. But she also said something like, well, maybe God knew that you just weren't ready to be a mom.
Oh, wow. Oh,
And
I'm so sorry.
yeah, thanks. And so that kind of just caused me to think, because I just did not understand why God, would open a womb and allow a pregnancy to occur, and then just to take it away, just to teach me a lesson that I wasn't ready.
Yeah.
So I was deeply hurt by that, and that kind of caused me to also kind of drift away from faith, because I felt like I couldn't trust God anymore to do what he supposedly was supposed to do, namely protect his kids.
Yes.
And
That seems a basic part of the promise. Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And so, so I just kind of put faith on the shelf, I guess. I still felt that pain, like the betrayal of, not being taken care of, but I didn't know what else to do. I continued my education, and then actually I became pregnant again late in 2012. And I remember thinking, it's like, okay, before I got pregnant, I think I had this internal deal of saying, God, you cannot, like, if you let me get pregnant again, only let me get pregnant again if it then stays the pregnancy, then I will be able to carry the term. And so I did actually have bleedings, though, in the first trimester, and I was super scared of losing the pregnancy again. And but I didn't, and so I was able to carry the term. But late during the pregnancy, I started having massive anxiety again about the pregnancy and about the baby, and I had seen some things, during my education, and what can happen as a complication, and I was just super concerned, and for some reason I was just super afraid of the baby dying before it was born. I don't know why it was that, but that was what I was afraid of. And so at some point then I went into labor, and I remember, us getting to the hospital, and then they hooked me up to the heart monitor, and everything was fine. I was like, finally, I'm here, I'm under supervision, now everything's going to be great. And the delivery actually went fine up to a certain point, and then it suddenly just flipped. Something happened, and we don't know really, and maybe I should trigger warn people, like, if you're pregnant, maybe you don't want to listen to the next part, because it might trigger you. Anyway, so we don't really know what happened, but just suddenly our baby's heart rate just dropped. And so they called for an emergency C-section. And I remember, just in this short period of being transferred into the OR, I was just thinking, I think this is happening because I wasn't faithful to God. That was kind of the thought I was having. It's like, no wonder I'm not under God's protection anymore. And no wonder this is happening to me. And so, yeah, they emergency delivered the baby, and he had to actually be resuscitated for a short period of time, but then kind of came around, and they took him away to neonatal care unit just for supervision. And when I woke up, he was already gone, and they told me he was fine, but he needed to be like supervised for 24 hours, and didn't transfer me to him for like another 12 hours because they didn't have
Oh,
like an opening. So that was super traumatic, and I was just, yeah, I was just in complete shock, and uh, well, I was kind of relieved that they said everything was going to be fine. But then everything was not fine because he then actually had a seizure after 20 hours.
oh, okay.
And then they discovered that he actually did have brain damage from the
Oh no.
delivery. So he had a massive stroke and a hemorrhage also in his brain. And then suddenly we were, in this hospital situation with this newborn baby that had a massive brain damage, and having to deal with the fact that he will probably be severely disabled.
Mm.
Um, and I remember, being there and thinking, I need to get back into faith. I need to, because as a doctor, I kind of knew that brain damage is not reversible. And so um, I was like, I realized, okay, my only option is for a miracle to occur.
I
you know,
see.
you,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
suddenly start believing in miracles
That's right. Yeah,
when
yeah,
you're in a situation like this.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, when we were discharged after a while, he was kind of doing okay. So we could go home. But we did, like, they told us they couldn't tell us what was going to, become of him, how he was going to develop. They just couldn't tell us.
Mhm.
And so we did not know. And so I, at that point, went to a Christian counselor because I was like, okay, listen, this happened, and I just kind of need to get back on the good side of God, um, and somehow convince him to heal my son's brain. You can imagine what happened. I very shortly after that dove headfirst into charismatic Christianity.
Okay. A surprise,
Surprise,
surprise.
surprise.
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
by that time, I had actually finished med school and also like started my first job in general surgery, and I thought it was awful because we had a lot of cancer patients and stuff, and I was like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, I need something much better than what we can do. And at that point, I just got in contact with um, a relatively big charismatic church in Berlin, and
Okay.
started hearing sermons about healing. It's like, this is exactly what I need.
Can I expound on something you just said there? I think that's really interesting.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Really interesting as a doctor,
Hmm.
you recognize kind of the limits of medicine, and there
Yes.
are real limits. That's just a fact of life.
Yes.
And then that desire to go beyond that, like, I want to
Yes.
heal my patients, I want my son to be healed, and like, what a natural desire, especially as someone who goes into the medical field. You want to
Yeah.
heal people, right? That's what you want to do.
Yeah.
So, and here's a group of people who are saying, you can not only you can do that, or we can do that, and
Hmm.
this is the message we're trying to give to you. And that would be very, very compelling.
Yes. And I also thought, yeah, I mean, if there was a God who was all powerful and good and loving, why wouldn't he heal people? I mean, it
Mm,
made
yeah,
sense, on a
yeah,
certain basis. And also, just reading the Gospels, it also made sense in the context of Jesus's ministry, constantly healing people. And that had always been kind of like a question for me. It's like, why isn't it happening now if it's the truth? Um,
yeah,
shouldn't it then, I think Jesus said something like, you'll do even greater works. And it's like, okay, where are they? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
um, yeah. And so, yeah, I went to this church and I was absolutely flashed, and I thought, this is it. This is where I need to be. I had this experience of what they call the baptism of the Holy Spirit,
Uh huh.
like the
Yeah.
very first service, started praying in tongues. Whatever it
Okay.
was, I had some sort of real experience.
Sure.
And I thought, okay, finally, now everything's going to be good. Um, and everything's going to be fine, and my son's going to be healed, and we're going to change the world, and Jesus is
Yeah.
going to come back soon. The whole package.
Yeah.
And I mean, the church was really nice people, really kind people, and they were super sincere, and I was super sincere. And so I quit my job and joined the church staff.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, because I figured, I might as well become a prayer surgeon rather than
Interesting.
yeah, because I felt like there's so many things, so many diseases that I cannot heal, and maybe if I do that, I would be able to.
I just want to stop again just to acknowledge,
Please.
how dedicated you have to be to say, I want to stop my career in medicine because I want to go beyond medicine and heal people beyond that. So like
Mm-hmm.
the level of commitment that takes, is very high. The why I bring this up is we so much hear the criticism of people who
You were never
deconstruct, and
really a
yeah,
Christian.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like I think I can't even imagine what that must be like to have that set of skills and still want to go beyond that and to dedicate your life to that in that way. So very dedicated, obviously.
Yes. So I took it all super seriously, and I was really hopeful, and thinking, if I figure this out, then I'm gonna get my son's brain from heaven,
Mm,
a new brain for him. Um, and plus, I was really super desperate also because
yeah.
as he was developing, it became obvious that he had severe developmental delay and problems with his motor skills and with his intelligence, his
Okay.
IQ. And so I was very aware that if nothing miraculous happened, then we will have a severely disabled child for the rest of our lives. And
Mm,
I couldn't face that, I just could not face the reality of pushing a wheelchair chair rather than a regular stroller for the rest of my life. And so I guess it was kind of also running away from reality and just grasping onto every straw that you can find. And in hindsight, I feel like that is such a mean dynamic, because I feel like, anyway, I'll get back to that later.
I'll say it for you that,
Mm.
people with real medical ailments or people
Yes,
with, real handicaps who go to healing ministries because that healing ministry says that they can be
yes,
healed. It is cruel
it
to those
is.
people, or in your case, the parent of someone with disabilities. It is absolutely cruel. So I'll say it
Yes,
for you.
thank you. And it's also deeply ableist,
True.
which I did not realize at the time. And
Yeah.
well, obviously, I see it now. You're always smarter looking back, but
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so I read every book there was on supernatural healing. Read, I listened to all the podcasts, and did all of that, and I had this have happened several times that I thought, okay, now I found the right theology. So now I found it. I was,
Yes.
okay, I was slightly off, but now I'm right, and now it's gonna work. And
Yeah.
after like 3 or 4 or 5 times of this, mental process, I was like, maybe something's not right. Maybe
Yeah.
something's just off. And what I also feel like is really annoying is that Christians keep coming up with increasingly ridiculous explanations of why certain things that everybody was super sure was going to happen and God promised actually don't happen. And it's always our fault, right? I mean, it's always, since God is perfect and we're the only imperfect ones in this relationship, it's got to be our fault, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is such a cruel dynamic of putting the responsibility and let's the blame of an illness upon the sick person, or the family of the sick.
Or the family. Yeah. I was going to say, on top of the stress of pregnancy and the real potential for things to go wrong,
Hmm.
also riding on that for you was, is God protecting me? Are God's promises true to me? And then your natural tendency was to blame yourself a bit. Like, maybe I'm not in the right space
Mhm.
and that's why I'm not protected. And, obviously none of that is true. As, not your fault.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's just, and that kind of pressure is cruel.
Yeah. And it worsened my anxiety a
I can
lot.
imagine.
So I think also for people who have a tendency, I'm not saying I have OCD, but I have OCD tendencies, I would say.
Hmm.
Religion is just cruel. It makes matters so much worse.
Yeah.
I have heard some people say that, they go through their day beating themselves up because they are not sure if they asked God whether they got the right beverage at, their
Yeah.
Starbucks or whatever. Um, it can be just totally crippling, to the point where people aren't able to, you know, do their daily stuff. So I was experiencing this growing frustration, and at some point, everybody kind of pulls the mystery card. It's like, well,
Mm.
I don't know why it's not happening, but I know God is good and I know he can be trusted. Even though we don't see any of it, you can still
Yeah.
trust him.
Right.
um, and at the same time, a mutual friend of, or not friend, an acquaintance, I would say, a person I knew, was actually diagnosed with ALS during
Mm.
her first pregnancy. Um, so she was not even 40 yet, and she was diagnosed with ALS during her pregnancy. And that was also one case that I kind of was not involved in, but I kind of um, saw how it all played out. And
Right.
how everybody was super sure that she was going to get healed, of course, and everybody was praying and everybody was trusting, and um, growing more and more desperate. And as she was, fading fast, and I just remember thinking, it's like, God, look, I mean, we're here, we're trying our best, and I just don't understand how you can let us grovel like that
Mm.
and not tell us what's missing. So, because, we're willing, so don't play the free will card on me, because
Right.
that's, always, well, people, well, free will. So, yeah, but everybody wants her to be healed. So that can't be the problem.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
and
Right.
so I thought it was just so cruel to, see his children cry and beg and grovel and pray and fast and do all the things we need to do, and just not tell us what the missing piece was so she could,
Right.
be restored. Anyway, so, and then so we're in 2019 now, and by the time I had developed like a serious conflict with my husband, because I realized that he had kind of more or less deconstructed, and
Okay.
I was super upset because I was like, wait, I'm getting serious about Christianity, about charismania. And he had kind of like, even when I joined the church staff, he was like, don't do this and you're going to regret this. And he was not supportive of it at all, which I now understand. But back then I was like, wait, I'm the righteous one here and you should
Yeah, you're
repent.
holding me back. You're holding me
Yes.
back.
And you're the reason that our son's not getting healed because you're not committed and
Uh,
you are the head of this household type thing. And so, um, looking back on this now, I was like, oh my goodness, what did I do? I treated him so poorly. Well, he was just being honest, but at that point, I just could not get over it, because everything, makes sense in that theological framework until it doesn't.
Inside the bubble, you have so
Yes.
much reinforcement.
Yes.
Every source of information is reinforcing it. Every person you talk to is reinforcing it. And so
Yes.
someone outside of the bubble who says, wait a minute, maybe that isn't true, just,
They're
it doesn't
deceiving
compute.
you.
Yeah, it doesn't compute. There's no way you can take that information in. Yeah.
Well, actually, and it's also built into the theology that, people just say, well, they're deceiving you. They're out.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're from the world. What do you expect?
Right.
Anyway,
Right.
and so I was also not sure whether our marriage was even going to make it through, because we were in such conflict about this, and was like, you promised me that we were going to be a Christian couple, and now you're not in faith anymore. And so I had to, listening to your podcast, I had to think about that so many times, like, oh goodness, I was the wife who was really giving her husband a hard time, and I'm so sorry. um,
Hindsight is 2020. I
yes.
totally, I totally get it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the end of 2019, where we're now in the story. And during that time, my mom, she had already not been feeling well for several months.
Okay.
And then we went to visit my parents. They live here in Berlin, kind of close. And I had not seen her for like 3 weeks or so. And we went to visit them, and I was just shocked about how she looked. And I didn't realize that she had been in such bad health. And my parents then told me that like her hand had been kind of having a tremor for a while, and I was like, when were you gonna tell me about this? And that was a Sunday night, and then Monday she called me and she was like, I'm feeling nauseous, and I'm having a vertigo, and what should I do? And I was like, you need to go to the hospital and get a CT scan fast. And so I urged them to just go see a doctor, like go to the emergency room now and get a scan,
Right.
which is what they did, luckily. And by that time, I was I already knew with my medical brain what was going to come of this, but I just kind of tried to repress it as long as it wasn't on paper. But they did find the brain tumor. That was like it came as a huge shock to me, and it didn't, because I'm a doctor and I see stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember, and then it was Christmas, and then she had surgery to remove part of the tumor, and then the histological results came back that it was a high-grade glioblastoma, which was pretty much, a fatal disease. Um, and at that point, I suddenly realized she's gonna die, and she's not a Christian. And that suddenly re-triggered my hell anxiety from when I first,
Yeah.
started with Christianity, and sent me spiraling into a huge panic attack. That was the worst one of all the ones that I've had up until that point. That was way worse. And my mental health declined so fast that I actually had to go to the hospital and get help, because I couldn't sleep anymore. I couldn't eat
Mm.
anymore. And so I called my pastor and I was like, I'm really struggling. This is what's happening. And he was like, well, obviously it's, it's a demonic attack.
Oh no. Yeah.
um, and that was just, it was absolutely totally awful. And so I had to go in and get treatment, because I wasn't able to sleep anymore. And after a few days without sleep, you go crazy.
Yeah.
um, so at that point, I was so massively anxious that I needed medication to even be able to sleep. And I realized at that point that I hated God. I
Mm.
was confronted with this whole hell subject again, with eternal conscious torment, which had never made complete sense to me. But my thinking went like, well, okay, so this is what's going to happen. She's not saved. She needs to get saved. Otherwise, she's going to go to hell. And if I don't tell her, her blood will be on my hands, right?
Mm.
That's what
Yeah.
Ezekiel says. If you did not warn them, their blood, I will demand their blood from your hands.
Yeah.
And at that point was the first time I realized that I actually hated God,
Mm.
which I had never been able to own up to, because I was afraid of him, of his punishment, and I couldn't own up to the fact that I actually hated this abusive deity that I was having a relationship with,
Yeah. Yeah.
because he wouldn't like that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It really is an abusive relationship, in that, like, anything good is to their credit. Anything bad is my fault. And
Yes,
yeah, it's just, yeah, and it's an
it's
ongoing cycle.
narcissistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know how they always say Christianity is not a religion; it's a relationship. That
Right.
makes it way worse, right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's it just it's not just a belief system; it's an abusive relationship with an abusive deity.
Yes.
I went to the hospital where I stayed there for several weeks, actually, getting treatment, and I was slowly able to kind of emerge out of this, which I think now was kind of a PTSD response, like trauma response of fight and flight or freeze. And I remember being there, and ironically enough, there was so many people of faith in that mental health facility.
Okay.
And I was just thinking, how come all the Christians who were supposed to, be so satisfied and have the full life and be so loved by the Heavenly Father end up in this medical
Interesting.
healthcare facility? How is that? Um, so that did not make sense. And I remember, and they were, the medical professionals there, they were really kind and nice and very trying to help me. But I remember talking to this one therapist, and she was like, so I wasn't even able to tell her the full story because I was so ashamed of the theology I was still believing, um, and of the abusive God that I was trying to still please and appease. Um, and so I just told her parts of it. I couldn't like tell her fully, and she was like, "Well, if the teaching at your church is too strict for you, just go find another one." And I was like, no, you don't get this. You don't
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
it. You don't understand what this is. And yeah, in hindsight, it was just really enlightening to me to then find the work of Marlene Winnell and the religious trauma syndrome as a word to describe what people are going through when they are indoctrinated with stuff like eternal conscious torment.
Yeah. You've mentioned the hell anxiety and just
Mm-hmm.
the panic attacks and things like that. And you said specifically, your body was having a reaction,
Yes.
and it's that part of the religious trauma that until you find that term even and discover this is a thing that people have experienced,
Mm-hmm.
you can finally feel like, oh, I'm not alone. It's not just me.
And I think mental health professionals are not yet educated at
No.
all on this subject. So it's really tough to find anybody who has any experience. So at that point, you just feel isolated and alone, and you feel like, okay, everybody in church doesn't seem to struggle with this. And is it just
Hmm.
me? Yeah, so that was kind of rough. And so I was there, and I was slowly starting to get better, and also slowly starting to realize I need to get out of this.
Yeah.
Because up until that point, I had always felt like, the small child that's kind of afraid of their dad and begging him not to beat them. It's like, so I'll do anything that you want, just don't punish me, don't beat me. And I remember that I felt this shift into, you know what? I don't care what you do to me. I just hate you.
Mm.
And nothing that you do is going to change that. Um, so it kind of felt like, going through the religion, the puberty phase of rebellion that I never
Yeah.
had because I was always so responsible and trying to be so nice and pleasing to everybody.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I remember feeling that was like the first point of empowerment that I felt in this whole process. Like, you know what? Nothing that you do can make me love you or make me stop
Hmm.
hating you. Um, and so at some point I started to realize, no, there's something within me that's actually true and that's safe, and there's something, a space within my heart that I can actually feel safe in.
Hmm.
um, and so then I slowly started kind of climbing out of the depression and um, the anxiety that I was experiencing with the help of medication, but I didn't have to stay on that forever. So
Okay.
I think it's just absolutely totally wonderful that we have those medications to just get over this phase.
Yeah. The counseling as well.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And yeah, and then I remember we were having a meeting at the hospital with one of my doctors and my husband and I, and talking about how long I was going to have to stay. And he was like, well, you're going to probably still have to be here for some time. And at that point, it was March 2020, and COVID started
Oh, wow.
hitting
Okay.
Europe. And then I kind of said to him, yeah, but if we have a COVID lockdown, which is a word that did not exist at that point, I
Right.
would I would rather be home with my family. And I remember him going, it's like, yeah, don't you worry, don't you worry. And 2 weeks later,
Uh,
we had a COVID lockdown. I was
oh,
like,
no.
I
Yeah.
told you people. That
Yeah.
was not my anxiety. That was actually correct.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, and so they actually told us, listen, this hospital is going to be put on lockdown, and you're not going to be able to leave. Nobody's going to be able to come see you, and daycare is going to close also. And so I was like, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go home. I can't stay. I just need to go
Good
home.
for you. Yeah.
Yes, and so actually that was really good for me to actually propel me out of this hospital, because otherwise it takes really long to actually come to the point. It's like, now I'm ready to go, because you never feel like you're ready. And so I left on a Friday. Monday morning I went to my GP and got my medication prescription, and Tuesday the lockdown started, and then I
Wow.
was home with my son for 8 weeks. And that was a time that was, obviously I was super bored, because everything was closed. You weren't supposed to do anything except maybe go for walks. And so I read massive amounts of stuff, of podcasts, of books, blogs, whatever, trying to figure this thing out. Um, but at that point, I was still kind of really fundamental. I was like, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm going to find the truth, and I'm going to be certain about it.
Yes.
um, but I was really, really thankful that I had this kind of space of, I don't need to go to church, and I don't need to go to work, because I was still on church staff, because I couldn't, because we were in lockdown. And so that was really the time where most of my deconstruction then happened. And throughout the lockdown, and then at some point, I knew I had reached the decision to quit. I mean, I knew I couldn't go back to work, because I didn't believe in this stuff anymore. Um, and so I talked to the church leadership, and I had been in contact with them, and they were kind to me. It wasn't that they were, treating me poorly, but obviously they could not understand what I was going through. Um, and then I just explained that I needed to go for the reasons that I had,
Right.
and they were kind. They agreed to, to do it nicely, and to just dissolve my contract that I had. And
Okay.
it was all very, yeah, kindly done. But still, I was like, listen, you people, something's going super wrong here. And at some point, I felt like, oh man, now I realize this is all a lie. And if I'm going to go and tell them, they're obviously going to see this, which is not what
Right.
happened at all. And that was also hard for me to deal with. Like, you have this realization, and you cannot unsee it, as you said. But they were still like completely, it's like, you are so absolutely fallen away
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
from faith.
I think that's really, really common. Like, you get to a point in deconstruction, deconversion where you just know this
Yeah,
is clearly not true anymore.
yeah,
And then you go to your friends around you and you're like, can't you see this? And like,
hmm,
it doesn't work, right? You
hmm,
can't change someone's mind. And it's a
yeah,
really painful process of recognition that, oh, I was there. I know what that feels like. And I
yes,
can't change their mind for them. It's really a hard thing to come to grips with.
yeah. And I also remember feeling a deep sense of loss of community, loss of friendships, and loss of God, who I really had invested so much into. And yeah, I mean, I spent a considerable amount of time trying to salvage my faith. It's like,
Uh-huh.
okay, I'm going to read every commentary. And then I kind of, read more progressive stuff. I was like,
Uh-huh.
okay, I'm going to read Love Wins, and I'm going to try to piece together
Yeah.
a theology that I can actually agree with. Um, and I don't know if you know the movie Luther with Joseph Fiennes. Do you know that movie?
I haven't seen that one, but I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's this one scene where he's also having a panic attack and he's fighting with the devil. So Martin Luther is, and
Yes. Yeah.
then his priest is coming in and sees him, struggling and fighting and having this anxiety attack, and then he goes, "So what are you actually looking for?" And then Luther looks at him and he's like, "I'm looking for a God I can love." And
Yeah.
that one line just touched me so deeply. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I'm trying to find a God I can love, and I cannot love this one because he's
Mm.
abusive. At that point, I came in touch with my longing for that God. At some point, you realize that, or I realized I wanted it to be true, and I didn't. Like both. It's
Yeah.
like there's an aspect of it that I so want to be true because I want there to be a good force that's looking out for us, that loves me, that cares about me. Um, but I don't want the rest of it. Which I guess Christians would say is cherry picking, but I would just say it's emotionally abusive.
It's a lot of grief too.
Yeah.
You've basically said it. You've lost community. You lose potentially relationships with friends and potentially with family, and that tight knit sense of a relationship. Even though it was
Hmm.
abusive, there's still that sense of someone who knows you and loves
Yeah.
you theoretically, and that feeling of being known is
Yes.
deeply satisfying. And so when you let go of that, you're grieving a lot of things. And then I'll add to that as well that part of what Christianity does is delay real grief. So
Yes.
the grief of the loss of your mom, the grief of the development of the delayed parts for
Hmm.
your son, and just
Hmm.
accepting reality and grieving the expectations you might have had. All of those kinds of things. Probably all of that comes down all at the same time and must
Hmm.
be very difficult to get through.
Yeah, and I think in the charismatic expression of faith, grief isn't really dealt with at all.
No.
Because
Yeah.
even if the person dies, they was like, "Well, you should celebrate; they're in heaven now," and type thing.
Right.
And so, uh, yeah, really processing grief was something that I had never learned. It was just really hard to figure that out on my own or on our own. Yeah, so that was what was kind of going on. So I tried to salvage my faith, parts of my faith, trying to maybe see if I could be more progressive, but the slippery slope is really as slippery as they say. It just
Yes.
it just all came apart, in my hands, and until nothing was left, and then I
Mm.
suddenly, at some point, needed to own up to the fact that I was now no longer a Christian. Um, and yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah.
And yeah, so during that time also, the acquaintance that I had mentioned with the ALS, she had also passed away. She had chosen
Mm.
to
Okay.
discontinue life support. um, and I remember going to see her grave, or her grave, and I remember standing there and looking at this and just thinking, there was just the sentence that dropped into my heart, where I was like, I'm never going to be able to tell anybody that God can be trusted.
Mm.
I won't be able to ever tell that to anybody again because it's
Mhm.
not true. And nothing's going to change the fact that I experienced this. And there's no way to not, have gone through this and to have come to this conclusion. And so that was really rough, because I then also realized that my son was not going to get his new brain that I had
Yeah.
kind of believed in, which was a huge part of, grief. And I also, of course, then realized that my mom was not going to live, either. And that was a lot that came just kind of crashing down on me. But it also, like, the pressure went away to be constantly fighting with reality. I felt like for the first time I had the space to actually accept reality for what it is and to look it in the face and to then take it and work with it and deal with it and actually do something with it, rather than, just denying it all the time and just be fighting it. And so, yeah, that also, yeah, was helpful for me to be able to accept my son the way he is with all his disabilities, and to be able to then see him and work with him where he is at, instead of constantly being frustrated that he doesn't have a healthy brain. So that took a lot of pressure off of our relationship, and I feel like it's better now than it was at that point, where I was just fighting against this state of being disabled. And it also saved my marriage.
Okay. All right.
Because
Yeah.
I have to say that, because during the time that I was in the hospital, and then just going through this deconstruction stuff, my husband was really amazing. Like, he was, he took care of our son, he took care of our apartment, he went to work every day, he did it all by himself, he did never once complain. um, and I realized, oh man, this guy is amazing. And I also realized that I had continuously, started to resent the person I was becoming because of the stuff I believed.
Mm.
Um, yeah. And then also there was a massive outpouring of pent up anger.
I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's another emotion that we really do not deal well in, in charismatic Christianity, or
Yeah.
generally in Christianity. Um, and I have to say, I'm still working through that. I have times where I'm massively angry, and where I just scream, at the God that I no longer believe in, to go f himself.
Yeah. Brian Peck talks about how that anger is really important to, especially in the analogy of the abusive relationship.
Yes,
Sometimes it's anger that pushes us out of the vicious cycle,
yes.
and it's valid. It's good. It needs to be expressed.
Yes, and it has so much momentum that it actually causes you to move. And that's what happened with me, and I felt like there was so much energy within this anger that I actually couldn't stay where I was, and it just pushed me out of this, yeah, I mean, out of victimhood, I would say,
Mm, yeah.
Um, yeah. And so to just finish up that part of the story, so I actually became pregnant again during that time,
Okay.
because we had wanted a second child for a while. And at that point, I felt like, if we get pregnant now, then maybe my mom will be able to actually meet her grandchild, um, which did not happen. So she passed away during my pregnancy, when I was
Oh, sorry.
23 weeks pregnant. Yeah. Um, but yeah, that's a whole different story that I'm probably not going to cram into this episode, but just to just kind of finish up the story. So that's what happened. And I was able to, do her funeral and stuff before then our second child was born, which was in July of 21. Our daughter was born by an elective C-section, and she was born healthy. And yeah,
Okay.
so we have two kids now.
Yeah.
uh,
Congratulations. Yeah.
yeah, that's the most part of the story.
Okay.
And now I'm here, and I don't know what to call myself. I don't really know if I need much of label anymore, because yeah.
Yeah. Again, the thing I say all the time is this is the beauty of it, is that you
Hmm.
get to discover, you get to choose whether you take labels or not and which ones
Hmm.
to take. And it sounds like you've already done this a lot, but you also get to just go research.
Hmm.
What do other people think? What
Yeah.
what are other people experiencing? And there's just no limitations on what you can explore, and it's painful, but it's also an exciting time.
Yeah, because there was always, thoughts that came up that didn't really make sense, but you during the Christian phase, you kind of always had to push them to the side and suppress them, because you couldn't, just allow them and then follow them, because they might lead you away from faith, and then you're gonna fall away and be lost. Um, so yeah, so it's just nice to be able to be curious,
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess agnostic would be the most correct label
Okay.
at this point in time, which is fine with me. But I still kind of grieve the fact that it doesn't really meet my spiritual needs as much. So I still have this element of longing and of ache for there to be something better than this life.
I
And
understand. I get it.
yeah,
That's the human condition. Yeah.
yeah.
Not to proselytize, but my quick
Mm,
response to that is I think that much of what Christians call the God-shaped hole
mm-hmm.
in our hearts
Yes.
is a people-shaped hole that we
Mm-hmm.
we crave to be loved and known by one another and to love
Yes.
and know each other, and that a lot of that draw towards spiritual things is really a draw towards connecting with other human
Yes.
beings.
Authentic connection. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Totally. I thought also during this process, obviously, during this time, I had to come to terms with the facts like, why did I ever get into this in the
Mm,
first place,
yeah.
And um, so then, you read books or you listen to podcasts and you do therapy or whatever. And then it was a good way for me to start working through maybe unhealthy relationship dynamics that I had all along. And I feel like often like religious trauma or religious trauma just kind of latches onto trauma that you already have
Hmm.
from your childhood or whatever. And I I remember, thinking about God and being so afraid of him and hating him for having to be afraid of him at the same time.
Hmm.
And um, I just thought about the fact that I already knew this feeling from earlier on, because there were aspects in my relationship with my parents that felt similar. And I think, as a child, you're the dependent one and you're the smaller one and the weaker one. And so you're dependent and uh, you're at the mercy of your parents, right? And then you have a great need for attachment also. So you try to protect the relationship at any cost. So you will do whatever your parent demands, pretty much, in order to protect the connection, because you depend on that, right? Your survival depends on the connection to your caregiver. And I realized I had just completely transferred that onto God 101,
Hmm.
because other people in the same situation would have maybe said, huh, are you kidding me? Uh, I'm never going to worship a God like that, and would have said that from the very beginning. But I was like, I was so um, already kind of groomed to tolerating abuse, I would
I
say,
see. Okay.
that I then just accepted the fact that God was like that also, and that he just gets to do whatever he wants because he's God.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
um, and yeah, and then the more I dove into that, I realized that God, the way I had conceptualized him, was a really unhealthy person. he was
Yes, yeah.
he was very egocentric and he was very immature and he was very narcissistic and he didn't take responsibility for his part of the relationship at
Yes,
all.
that's right.
um, and he didn't keep his own rules either, and which I also found just really hurtful, because I felt like, come on, I'm trying to make this relationship work, and why isn't anything with you working? Which I guess in a parent-child relationship you would call parentification, right? Where the child just assumes all the responsibility for the relationship, which I also did with one of my parents. And so I felt like, they were already, like, the neural pathways in my brain were already there. And then I just exchanged my dad for God, and there went my religious trauma. Yeah.
I do want to hear before we wrap up what you are finding useful now. Are you still seeing a therapist, or do you have community anywhere? Are there any particular books or podcasts other than this one that you find useful?
Yeah, I wasn't sure how much we were allowed to name drop here.
Yeah, you can name drop. It's fine.
Okay, I can name
Yeah,
drop. Good.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that I did was I actually started an Instagram account, a small
Oh,
one,
okay. Yeah.
um, because I felt like that there were certain things that I was saying to the God that I no longer believed in, like constantly over and over, such as like, God, if you're constantly angry, maybe you should go see a therapist type thing.
Yes, exactly.
And I was saying these things in my head so frequently. It's like, I need to get this out of my system. So I started a Instagram account where I wrote out all my painful post Christian prayers, which is actually the name of the account. And that was extremely cathartic. It was very helpful to just get it out of my system, and then also see, people starting to interact with my content and realizing, oh, I'm not alone with how I feel about this. And that's just been so very validating to realize, okay, no, I'm not strange. This is what other people are also experiencing, and other people also find this abusive, so I must not be totally off.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very helpful. Yeah, and plus the online community, the possibilities of the internet and social media to be able to connect with people all over the world, because this is kind of a niche subject, right? It's kind of like, it's a niche, and because your non-Christian friends don't understand what you're going through,
Exactly.
your still Christian friends do not realize what you're going through on the and tell you that you're falling away and you need to get back to church. And so it can feel very lonely. And so I found the internet, especially during the time of the pandemic, to be super helpful, to be able to connect with people. Yeah, and then during that time where I was desperate to find resources, I just started Googling the internet for resources. And what I found very helpful was, I think I came onto a YouTube recording or so of a podcast with a guy called John Steingard.
Yeah.
He was the lead singer of a Christian band, and he publicly deconstructed. And up until that point, I had never heard of public deconstruction much. And so I listened to that episode, and it was actually, I think, an episode with Phil Drysdale.
Yeah.
And so I started listening to his podcast, and that was very helpful, especially the episodes he has on spiral dynamics and human psychological development and stuff, realizing that, oh, this process of deconstruction that's happening to me is actually psychological growth. It's actually the stage that you're supposed to be moving through once you get older. And it's, then normal to actually lose your sense of certainty and to come to a place of realizing, okay, I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer to almost any question.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was very, very helpful. And then also the book Wayward by Alice Gretchen. I think you also had a podcast episode with her.
So Alice is amazing, and I think I loved her book was great. So
yeah. So I read her book and I was like, oh my God, this woman is so eloquent and so very talented in describing this process and also the mental process of deconstruction. And I could identify very much with her, and just profited much from reading her book. And that was actually, I tried then to find podcast episodes with her, and that's how I came across your podcast.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And then listened to your episode with her, and that was very helpful. The work of Marlene Winnell, obviously, and her book Leaving the Fold. Those were, and there are 1,000 more. I could go on and on for hours. Yeah.
Julia, I say all the time that when people tell their stories with real vulnerability, that has the biggest impact. And I think you went deep here today. I know this is going to have an impact on people. I want to give you one more opportunity to say the Instagram account, and we'll have that in the show notes as well.
Okay.
But one more time, what's the Instagram account?
It's called Painful Post-Christian Prayers. So it started as just me writing out the prayers that I was constantly praying, angry prayers at a God that I no longer believed in. And I guess it shifted a little more towards like broader content. So it's not formulated as prayers as much anymore, but yeah. All so right. That's what I'm doing. And other than that, I'm working as a doctor in a hospital again.
Yay! I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah. So that's fantastic. Also one thing I'm super thankful for, that I actually have a vocation that I trained in that I was able to go back to after leaving professional Christianity, because I realized that's something that some people don't have. And, if you've been a pastor for 20 years and that's your only income, then deconstruction is a lot harder
Yes.
to accept. So, yeah, I'm very thankful for that.
Julia, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. Fuck purity culture indeed. I love Julia's honest expression of anger, and anger even towards a God that she does not believe in. We'll talk more about this in the Secular Grace Thought of the Week section, but just to say here quickly that it is important to express your anger and frustration and not to bottle that up and feel like you're not allowed to do so. Julia's story is heart-wrenching and also inspirational. The level of dedication that it would take to decide to leave medicine to go into what she believed to be a healing ministry because she wanted to actually heal people. That kind of dedication is so clear in Julia's story. She wanted the perfect Christian marriage. She wanted to do all the things right. But underlying all of this is a very painful sense that when she was young, she felt responsible for the eternal salvation of those around her. As she got older, she felt the responsibility for healing people, including her son, who was developmentally delayed due to the stroke after his birth. All of these things she felt on her shoulders, and when God didn't come through, the initial instinct is to think, well, I haven't done something right. The hardest line in the entire episode is when she was in the hospital having her difficult pregnancy. She said, I think this is happening because I wasn't faithful to God. That instinct is deadly, and where the abuse in the church begins by instilling that idea that if you don't get what you pray for, it's your fault in some way, is just horrifyingly abusive and wrong. And it breaks my heart for Julia. One of my favorite lines that she said is that she tried to salvage her faith, but the slippery slope is really just as slippery as they say. I absolutely loved that. I loved her sense of humor, and I celebrate with her that she was able to go back to the field of medicine and begin to, in her words, for the first time, she had space to actually accept reality for what it is. You can find Julia's work on Instagram at Painful Post Christian Prayers. That's definitely something you're going to want to check out. I want to thank Julia for being on the podcast and for truly going deep, being utterly vulnerable and honest about her story. This is why I do this podcast. It's these kinds of interviews that I think are really significant. And I hope that you heard a bit of your own story in Julia's. Thank you, Julia, for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about anger. And what I have to say about anger is nuanced. So I'm going to begin with where I begin. And that is because the atheist movement tends to be pure anger, just rage and unbridled anger. And I actually started the podcast to counteract that, to say, if you're leaving faith, you may not want to burn the bridges behind you in a blaze of glory and destroy relationships with people with whom you might want to continue to be in relation. That was especially poignant for me because my wife is still a believer and I wanted to remain married to her. I love her very much. And what I saw, what was online, what was available was just everyone's stupid and wrong, and I'm angry at them. So it's still true that I don't think that one should remain in anger forever. I don't think that you should remain in anger with the people around you. And of course, I personally don't believe that God exists. So being angry at God is kind of a difficult mental gymnastic. However, having said all of that, I'll retell the story here that my conversation with Brian Peck from the Religious Trauma Institute really pushed me to recognize the benefit of anger. And here's the benefit of anger. When you are in an abusive relationship, and that includes God, anger will get you out. When you are in a situation that is hurting you, anger will help you get out. So anger has its place. There is something important about being angry. And I think part of the grief process is, and I don't mean this in a simplistic steps of grief kind of way, but I think part of the grief process of the loss of faith, of the loss of a sense of relationship with God, of a loss of community, is to be angry about it. And certainly to be angry about the abusive parts of religion, Christianity, whichever faith tradition you came from. Just listening to Julia's story makes me angry at the healing ministries that know they cannot heal real injuries, something beyond a headache or psychosomatic elements. And yet they make that promise, and that makes me angry. And I'll wrap this up with saying my recognition of my loss of faith was actually reading a Greta Christina article about why are atheists so angry. And it was a list of things that are perfectly reasonable to be angry about religion. When religion crosses the line from having personal faith and doing good works to abuse, manipulation, and hurting people, it's okay to be angry about that. And it was my recognition that I agreed with basically every point she had that I suddenly realized that I no longer believed. This podcast will continue to advocate secular grace, to love the people around you, including the believers in your life. But in no way am I saying something like the church, be angry and do not sin. What I'm saying is be angry as long as it's useful, and then at some point in time, come out of that and recognize that you cannot live in anger forever, that just being angry alone isn't enough. We have to actually connect with each other and love each other. And that does not mean accepting your abuser in any way. Almost every week I say that we've got some amazing interviews coming up, but we really do. Next week we have Arlene interviewing Treasure. I'm loving these conversations that Arlene has been doing, these interviews. Arlene has the ability to reach people that I can't. So if you have any hesitation, you want to tell your story, but you're uncomfortable doing so with me, please reach out to us. I'll get you in touch with Arlene, and Arlene can conduct that interview. After that, we have Daniel, who's a member of our Deconversion Anonymous community, and he also has a background in psychology and social science. We have a really interesting conversation about the way evangelical organizations are trying to view deconstruction and what it means to them and how they get things wrong. After that, we have Jessica Moore, who is a life coach trying to help people come out of purity culture. And more after that. I've got a bunch of things lined up. So this is just a really good season of interviews. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.